رمضان 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 فرصة عمر.
Google is not an imam. We live in a time where many things have become easy, and where things that previous generations might not have imagined have become the norm. We live in the age of the internet, where abundant information is often at a person's fingertips, where ideas are shared freely across the world and accessed by people of different nationalities and cultures by way of a screen, be it a phone or a computer or something else. And yet, despite the ease of sharing information at this time, and despite the fact that some services have been facilitated for Muslims through the internet in many ways, and that Muslims around the world have benefited from the rise of the internet, we find that misguidance in the Islamic world still spreads, and that ignorance about basic religious concepts abounds, and that division is rampant. What is the reason? There are many reasons, but among the biggest is that a lot of people do not use the internet properly and have come to see it as their go-to source of Islamic knowledge and have turned their backs on traditional methods of Islamic learning and scholarship. This is not really something to be surprised about. The more time passes, the closer we get to the Day of Judgment. And the Prophet ﷺ told his companions that among the signs of the Day of Judgment is the spread of ignorance. Al-Imam al-Bukhari and Al-Imam Muslim narrated that he said, إِنَّ مِنْ أَشْرَاطِ السَّاعَةِ أَنْ يُرْفَعَ الْعِلْمُ وَيَثْبُتَ الْجَهْلِ, which means that among the signs of the Day of Judgment is for knowledge to be lifted and ignorance to prevail. The Prophet ﷺ also said, as narrated by Al-Bukhari and Muslim as well, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَقْبِضُ الْعِلْمَ انْتِزَاعًا يَنْتَزِعُهُ مِنْ قُلُوبِ النَّاسِ ولكن يقبض العلم بقبض العلماء حتى إذا لم يترك عالما اتخذ الناس رؤوسا جهالا فسئلوا فأفتوا بغير علم فضلوا وأضلوا. Which means that Allah does not take away knowledge by pulling it from the hearts of people, rather by taking away the scholars, that is, by willing for them to die, until He doesn't leave a scholar, and the people take ignorant leaders who are asked and give answers without knowledge and become misguided and misguide others. We are witnessing this happen around us as we speak, unfortunately. Most people nowadays would rather look up the answers to their questions on Google, which only stores information, it can't determine for you what's right and what's wrong, than actually seek out a trustworthy scholar to ask in person. And even many of the people who are motivated enough to seek out knowledge directly from a teacher sometimes end up under the wing of teachers who are not qualified themselves, because, as the Prophet said, ﷺ, as the Day of Judgment gets closer, the scholars die off and people begin to take the unqualified as leaders and teachers. They ask them, and those people lead them astray. So, what are we to do? If you really want to avoid being among those led astray, then first, you should make dua to Allah sincerely to guide you, and then you should put real effort into humbling yourself, seeking out a trustworthy teacher, sitting at his or her feet, and learning directly from his or her mouth. This is the method of learning employed by the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, and the Salaf, and the pious scholars of the Khalaf. And they did not rely simply on reading books without a teacher, or worse, searching things on Google or YouTube, which often present sources to the person which are unknown or unvetted. The companions were very keen to hear the hadith of the Messenger ﷺ directly from the source. One companion famously traveled after the death of the Prophet ﷺ from Al-Hijaz to Egypt just to meet another companion and hear one hadith from his mouth. The scholars of the Salaf and the Khalaf did similar. If you read the biographies of famous scholars, recognized by all of Ahlus Sunnah as being rightly guided, you will find that it says, سَمِعَ مِن فُلَانٍ سَمِعَ مِن فُلَانٍ وَسَمِعَ مِن فُلَانٍ, meaning, he heard his knowledge from this person, and he heard it from that person, and he heard it from that person, etc. And you wouldn't find that it says, oh, he read this book and this book, meaning alone, without a teacher. Some of the scholars, you would find that they had 1,000 shaykhs, some of them more, meaning thousands of people that he learned from directly. Why? Books existed back then, even if they weren't as widespread as they are now, and there wasn't any internet or search engine to gather them, but they did exist. Why didn't they just read and formulate their own opinions based on that? Because that is not the method of learning that ensures you remain on the path of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That is generally the path of those who go astray. Nowadays, many people who are seen by some as imams or academic authorities of one sort or another are in reality page flippers. They read books without a teacher or a guide who shows them the correct way and instills the basic obligatory knowledge of the religion in them, and warns them against the inaccuracies and false information found in many books and sources out there today. They read books on their own and interpret them for themselves and come up with opinions that contradict what came in the Quran or the Hadith or what the scholars came to a consensus about. Or they learn from people who did that, meaning that they read on their own and formulated their own opinions and came up with things that contradict the Quran and the Hadith and the consensus and so on. And so, as the Prophet ﷺ said, ضَلُّوا فَأَضَلُّوا, they go astray and they lead others astray. A lot of people nowadays, when you tell them, learn from a teacher, seek a chain of narrators for your Islamic knowledge, going back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they say, why? I can just read the Quran for myself and the books of Hadith for myself. They are available online. And usually such people aren't even reading the Quran. They are reading the translation, which is usually filled with errors and misguided interpretations. Likewise with the books of Hadith that they claim to read. The scholars of the past used to warn against commoners reading in the books of Hadith by themselves in Arabic, let alone a translated version in another language. But for some reason, many people nowadays see no issue with such things. And so as the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, ضَلُّوا فَأَضَلُّوا, they went astray and they led others astray. Those same people who neglect the traditional method of learning Islamic knowledge and resort to reading on their own, then have the gall to give their opinions on religious matters, would they be as lenient if it came to their health? No, definitely not. If they were to find someone who read a bunch of medical journals online and watched some YouTube videos on how to perform surgery, they would not say, okay, guess he must be qualified to treat me and take him as a doctor. They wouldn't even be so lenient when it came to their car. Would they trust someone who watched some YouTube tutorials and read a couple of books as a mechanic? No, they wouldn't. Rather, in the case of the doctor or the mechanic, no one normally trusts either unless they have studied their profession in the proper way, learning hands-on from others who have experience in the field. We Muslims should be even more cautious when it comes to our religion, because our belief is that getting it right is the difference between torture or reward in the hereafter, paradise or hell. Muhammad ibn Sirin, the famous scholar from the time of the Salaf, said, إِنَّ هَذَا الْعِلْمَ دِينٌ فانظروا عمن تأخذون دينكم, which means this knowledge is your religion. So be careful who you take your religion from. One does not become a scholar or qualified to answer religious questions just by reading books on one's own, whether on the internet or not. Al-Shaykh Abdul Ghani al-Nabulusi, a famous scholar, once said, لا تحسبن أن بالكتب مثلنا تصير فللدجاجة ريش ولكنها لا تطير, which means, do not think that through books only will you become like us, meaning the scholars, for chickens have wings, but they do not fly. The proper way to learn is to find a teacher who has a chain of narrators for his knowledge going back to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to learn from him, even if this takes more effort than relying on Google and the internet, because Google is not an imam.